Her Majesty Elizabeth II is only the fourth generation of a relatively new dynasty. If we put her Uncle Edward VIII between brackets, whose reign lasted less than a year, she is only the third Windsor. The first member and founder was her grandfather King George V. The second was her uncle Edward VIII, and the third was her father George IV. However, as you know, the British monarchy is one of the oldest in the world. How did this dynasty of Queen Elizabeth II form? How and when did it happen? That is what we are going to explain to you in this video. Today's House of Windsor was born less than a century ago, in 1917, moving away from the previous house, the Hanover, which had connections to Germany. The ancient British monarchy, that of Queen Victoria, the fecund Queen Empress, and her son Edward, the strange and cunning Emperor King, was at the center of a gilded royal network that stretched across Europe and Russia. Even the concept of the royal family emerged in the second half of the 19th century with Prince Albert, Queen Victoria, and their 9 children. The monarchy was a family club, with access forbidden to others. The British part of this network had close connections with the German royal house, dating back to the 18th century and the Hanoverians. The Kaisers had tea and paraded in British military uniforms. The closeness was symbolized by the last visit of King George V and Queen Mary to Germany before the First World War. They met with the Kaiser, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and a plethora of cousins of the dynasty that the family treated simply as the royal flock. George V had a special affection for his Austro-Hungarian royal relatives and the various German princes and princesses in his family. But despite the apparent friendship between cousins and friends of the flock, tensions were rising between the countries. The First War was about to break out. In 1917, sunk in the bloody sludge of war, the royal connection seemed more likely to strangle the British monarchy than to protect it. The Germans became disliked in Britain. Being a monarch with connections to Germany became inconvenient. Growing radical and revolutionary sentiments throughout Europe made the monarchy unpopular as well. King George was informed of the dangers that revolutionary socialist ideals posed to him. Between 1911 and 1912, Britain faced huge strikes and riots. On one side were the socialists, on the other were the liberals calling for an end to the monarchy. King George had luck with his advisors, especially Arthur Bigge, known as Lord Stanfordham. In the years leading up to World War I, he worked hard to transform the sea wolf and provincial king into a national leader with political awareness. When the war began, and during the first complicated years, George V became a vivid and popular focal point. In the spring of 1917, the news the advisor was giving the king seemed extremely alarming. The war was getting worse and worse. There were growing strikes and complaints, claiming that the king was closer to his German cousin, the hated Kaiser, than to his own people. Anti-German sentiment among the British peaked in March 1917 when the Gotha G4, a heavy plane capable of crossing the English Channel, began bombing London and turning itself into a household name. The buzz grew. On March 31, 1917, a rally at the Albert Hall, headed by one of the Labour Party's great heroes, George Lansbury, celebrated the fall of Tsar Nicholas II, where the monarchy was heavily criticized. At the time, war censors prevented such news from being published in newspapers, but King George had eyewitnesses who told him what had happened. And, of course, the fake news of the time spread like fire in a haystack. People believed the most incredible stories about confabulations with the Germans and secret blackmail networks, as well as sex scandals involving the court itself. The backdrop of the war did not help. The armies in France were defeated, and the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean became a graveyard filled with supply ships. Russia had been invaded, Germany was nearby, and there was a growing insurgency in British factories. In Britain, the key leader during the war was not the king, but his biggest critic, Lloyd George, who was considered the man who won the war. The aristocracy, which had always supported the monarchy, had surrendered. Their children were dead or crippled. Their estates were financially ruined. The monarchy, it seemed, had few powerful friends. Faced with this, George V decided that, to save the monarchy in Britain, radical reform was necessary. Advised by Stamfordham, King George made several changes that had a great influence on the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. The first and most notable was to change his name and the name of the dynasty. Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was not only a fading name, but clearly German. The surname was acquired by the family through Queen Victoria's marriage to Prince Albert, since she was also Saxe-Coburg on the maternal side, but continued the Hanover dynasty, since a new dynasty only emerged through the paternal side, as happened with her son. King Edward VII inaugurated the Saxe-Coburg dynasty, and King George V was the second in that lineage, which had now been discarded. Interestingly, George was unaware of his original surname. Monarchical lineages and uncontrolled hyphenations were too confusing. The Royal Council of Heraldry was consulted. The king was told that his surname was not Stuart. They started looking up for a made-up surname. Tudor Stuart, Plantagenet, York, and Lancaster were considered, but also discarded, in addition to the obvious ones like England, which was very unlikely to please the Scots, Irish, or Welsh. There were more obscure suggestions like Fitzroy. The astute Lord Stamfordham rediscovered the name of the place where the king's favorite palace stood, suggesting Windsor. Not only did the name sound good, but it was discovered that King Edward III had used it. As such, there was a tenuous historical justification. Thus, on July 17, 1917, the Windsor Dynasty was born. George V announced, "We, for our own good and for the good of our descendants, renounce and order the discontinuance of the use of the degrees, styles, dignities, titles, and honors of the dukes and duchesses of Saxony, and princes and princesses of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and all other German degrees." A huge change of surnames followed, confusing many people to this day as to who was who. Any reference to Germany was promptly deleted. Less publicly, but more important than the name change, was the pronouncement made by King George V and Queen Mary, ordering their descendants to marry into British families. During her reign, Queen Victoria had suggested that the British monarchy should accept marriages with other families. The new blood, and she was referring to the blood of plebeian British families, would morally and physically strengthen the throne. This measure was implemented by George V of the House of Windsor. The British monarchy was nationalized. The king's announcements of this new rule in 1917 paved the way for Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, a Scot whose family had been prominent during the war, to marry Albert, the Duke of York, and later King George VI. The rule also allowed Prince Charles to marry Diana and then Camilla, and made possible Prince William's union with Kate Middleton. It may seem trite these days, but the marriage of royalty to their subjects had never crossed the mind of the ancient house of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. The king's next step was even more brutal, according to some, cowardly. George V ignored his cousin Nicky, the deposed Russian Tsar II, and his entire family, leaving them at the mercy of Lenin's Bolshevik revolutionaries. The Tsar, unlike the Kaiser, had been a loyal ally of the British crown until the collapse of the empire. George even reconsidered giving his cousin asylum, but it was too late. Nicholas and his family were imprisoned, exiled, and eventually killed. The next change came in the honor system. Most countries had such systems. Britain's was not only limited, but totally entangled with the designs of royalty. The final step in creating the House of Windsor was to make the king into something more popular. The goal was to make him prominent on the streets, in the works, sponsoring art and science. The monarch was to be seen everywhere, showing his efforts and increasing his popularity. The way Elizabeth reigns today, what she does, how she is seen and described, stems from the decisions made by her grandfather when Europe was struggling in bloody conflicts and Britain was facing starvation and defeat at the hands of captains commanding military submarines. George V was the first important man in Elizabeth's life, the old naval officer who smelled of smoke, whom she played with as a child and remembers well, was the real founder of the House of Windsor, known as the Firm. The crisis of 1917 created a British-sized royal family, which severed relations with his German origins and Russian relatives, and made specific errors to put down deeper roots in the underground of British life. Lord Stamfordham, besides choosing the name, gave the House of Windsor its founding principle when he wrote in the same year, "We must endeavor to make the thinking working masses, the socialists and others look upon the crown not as an empty symbol, as an institution which, as they say, counts for nothing, but as a living power for good, which influences the interests and welfare of all classes." This was the mission George took on, and which his son and granddaughter continued. It was the most important sentence a court official ever wrote, and it remains the most influential. King George V died in 1936, when he was replaced by Edward, his eldest son. Crowned Edward VIII, the new king occupied the throne for only 9 months. At the end of 1936, he exchanged the British crown for a woman. Wallis Simpson, the American with whom Edward had fallen in love, was divorced and would not be accepted as queen. Off the throne, Edward married Wallis in 1937. George VI replaced his brother in December 1936 and reigned until he died in 1952. Alongside Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who died in 2002, he was famous for his courage during World War II, which he refused to leave Buckingham Palace during the bombing of London by the Nazis. The place was bombed 9 times during the war. After George VI's death, Queen Elizabeth II assumed the throne, and she reigns to this day. Even with the changes in the House of Windsor, the royal family remained extremely wealthy, served by aristocratic servants, locked away in their castles and palaces most of the time. These changes implemented by George V were especially important for the continuity of the British monarchy. Without them, the crown would have come to an end. In the same period, monarchies in countries such as Turkey, Germany, and Austria-Hungary eventually fell after the First World War. Also, in the first half of the 20th century, 4 other countries lost their kings and queens and became republics. Great Britain managed to get through both world wars and remain to this day with a parliamentary monarchical government. How? The most accepted theory is that the English monarchy is the one that best adapts to the new times, elevating itself whenever necessary. The current queen has an enormous capacity to be present in the lives of her subjects, even regarding the young, and she offers herself as a cultural product, something that is not replicated in other European monarchies. As an example of her connection to the younger public, Elizabeth made her first Twitter post alongside with her grandson, Prince Harry, to make a joke with the Obama family. Or her entrance at the 2012 London Olympics, where she participated in the James Bond movie and an actress representing the monarch landed in the stadium by parachute. The attempt to stay close to the people may be the great secret recipe of the British. Weddings, for example, were private for a long time, with no access from the public. But Elizabeth and Philip broke this tradition and used the new technologies of the time to become the first royal couple to broadcast the ceremony on TV. The same happened on the day of the coronation of the new monarch, the first to become queen live on screens around the world. Since then, the planet has followed the union of several descendants of the monarch, such as Charles and Diana, William and Kate, and Harry and Meghan. The hope now is to be able to follow the lavish coronation ceremonies of the next members of the line of succession. Even in institutional crises, such as the death in 1977 of Lady Di, the royal figure most loved by the British and the international public, the sovereign eventually broke protocols, listening to her subjects and organizing traditional funeral ceremonies for her former daughter-in-law, who had lost the title of Her Royal Highness and member of the Windsor when she separated from Charles. With their great influence, many people question if the Windsor family will ever leave the power of the United Kingdom, and if, for the first time, the nation will cast aside the old monarchical government. It all depends on Elizabeth's successors.